Thank you. Okay, there they are. So who can tell me something about these bad boys? Yes?
They're aligned with the belt stars.
Very good. They're very, very precisely aligned astronomically, and one of the most important alignments is with the belt stars of Orion. Yes? They're outside of Cairo, and a plateau. The area is called Giza, and all the pyramids that were constructed, some at Giza, some at Darfur, some at Saqqara, were always placed on the west bank of the Nile River because that's the side which has the setting sun, and the whole purpose of the pyramids is to allow the pharaoh to die and be reborn in the east. So he wants to start in the west. They're made mostly of limestone, two kinds of limestone. One, a relatively coarse limestone, which was found near the site, which is used for most of the interior of the building. Coarse because you can actually see fossil shells and so on compacted into the limestone. A much higher quality of limestone, which came from a little bit farther away from a quarry called Tura, which was used for the facing, which is no longer there. We'll talk about that some more too. 280 cubits high and 440 cubits at the base. What's a cubit? Length from your elbow to the tip of your fingers. We can actually reconstruct fairly accurately what the royal cubit was, the cubit that was used for royal projects, and it's just a little bit over 20 inches. So the pyramids, two largest ones are about 700 feet long at the base, about 1/8 of a mile. First, let me say that the order they were built in was Khufu, also known to the Greeks as Cheops, or sometimes Cheops if you pronounce it wrong, Khafre, and Menkaure. So this was the first one. Now, from this vantage point, Khafre's looks bigger, but it's actually slightly smaller. It's just placed on a higher part of the bedrock, and from this angle it looks taller, but actually Khufu's pyramid is just slightly taller. But this one, Menkaure's, is decidedly, very definitely, much smaller than the other two. Now, why would that be? The grandfather, the father, and the grandson here, why would the grandson accept a pyramid that was so much smaller than his predecessors? Did they run out of limestone? No, we know where the quarries are. There is still plenty of limestone there. It must have been a deliberate decision for some reason. Yes?
Could it have been he died sooner and less time to build the pyramid?
That's a possibility, but we're going to look in detail at another theory that has to do with the belt stars of Orion. Anything else? Okay, the reason these pyramids survive, partly because of their size, these are still today, in terms of volume of building materials, these pyramids are almost completely solid inside. In terms of total volume of building materials, these are still the largest buildings on Earth. The other thing that has helped them to survive is that they're made of hard stone. And this is not totally an accident. The fact that we don't have comparable monuments from the Sumerians, Babylonians, is because they didn't happen to be in an area where tectonic plates collide. Where tectonic plates collide is where you can expect to find large quantities of hard stones. Now, there are some problems, not with the pyramids, but with our understanding of the pyramids and how they were built. Two types of stone used. One is limestone, which has a hardness on the Mohs scale of between 3 and 4. The other is granite in certain key locations, which has a hardness of 6 at least. And what kind of tools did they have available to them to work these hard stones? Yes? Wood. They used wooden mallets. Harder stone. That's probably one of the key things. And so you have to start imagining these huge blocks of stone being shaped and finished to incredibly flat sides and sharp edges simply by taking a harder stone and banging on it until it gets to where you want it to be. That's almost certainly what had to be done with the granite. Yes?
Did they have copper tools?
They had copper tools, yes, not iron tools, and not bronze. Although there is a fair amount of, there's a lot of hard stone and a fair amount of copper in this area, it turns out that there's very little tin, which is the metal that's most commonly used to make an alloy with copper to make bronze, which is harder than copper. There's almost no tin to be found in this area. So apparently the only thing they had available to them was perhaps some copper with natural impurities. Arsenic is sometimes mentioned. Arsenic is actually a metal, although you think of it as a powder from your murder mysteries. It's actually a metal which can be alloyed with copper to make it a little bit harder. Another thing you can do with copper to make it harder is simply to forge it. You pound it when it's hot, and you pound and you pound and you pound, and gradually it gets a little bit harder, but it's really hard to see how you could, without bronze, how you could get something as hard as even limestone. Certainly nothing approaching the hardness of granite. And so there are many theories that have been proposed. The only one that I really put any credibility in is that they used copper saws which had rough teeth, which were not hard enough to cut the rock, but they poured sand into the slot that they were sawing. And the copper saw rubbed the sand, which has, you can find good sand that has a lot of quartz in it, and quartz is indeed even harder than granite, certainly harder than limestone. The problem is, while you're sawing, the quartz is doing as much damage to your saw as it is to the rock. Okay? So we don't even have any surviving copper saws because they were probably all used up. So whatever they did, it's an incredibly laborious process, and we don't fully understand exactly how they were able to fashion these blocks in such large numbers so accurately. Here, by the way, is a dolerite ball. Dolerite is harder than granite. There are balls like this all over the quarries where the granite was extracted, and one of them was actually found placed in a little niche inside the Great Pyramid. So we're pretty sure that pounding granite with dolerite balls was how the incredibly accurate finish was achieved. Yes?
Did they use wooden wedges on the limestone? I know they did that with granite.
It's probable that they use wooden wedges, but then what you got to pound with something.
Right.
The only thing we can imagine is a copper chisel,
Right.
which is going to get worn away. It does you absolutely no good on the granite, and is even probably going to you're going to spend a lot of time sharpening your tools, because you pound away, and the copper gets more damage than the rock that you're trying to pound on. Okay, so there's a mystery right from the start. How did they work these hard stones to such incredible finish? All right, now here there is one little spot on the Great Pyramid, Khufu's pyramid, where the original outer limestone casing still survived. It was actually buried under the sand. until it was uncovered in the 19th century. You can see the nice smooth faces. They go in and try to measure. There are multiple blocks here together. You can look at the cracks between the blocks. They're typically about 2/100ths of an inch of gap between two blocks. The Khufu's pyramid used to be entirely covered in this beautifully finished smooth limestone. So you would not see the steps of the levels when it was completed and the way it was meant to look. You would see a beautiful smooth white surface going all the way up to the top. So white, in fact, that there's speculation that the pyramid could have been used as a sun shadow device. When the sun was low enough, you cast a shadow behind, and when the sun is too high, so the shadow actually falls on the pyramid itself, you could imagine that the white surface would reflect a beautiful bright triangle onto the plaza in front to the south of the pyramid. Where did all that limestone casing go? Well, in the 1300s, there was a terrible earthquake in Cairo, and they had to rebuild everything. And they had a very convenient source of very nicely finished limestone blocks, which they hauled away and used to build, among other things, the famous Sultan Hassan Mosque in Cairo. So this is all made of casing stones stolen from Khufu's pyramid. The pyramids at Giza were not the first pyramids by any means. The construction of pyramids began a couple of dynasties earlier at another location a little bit farther up the Nile, not quite so close to Cairo, still on the west bank at a place called Saqqara. And this is Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara, which was constructed by the architect Imhotep, very famous and very highly regarded by the ancient Egyptians. He was not only the architect who figured out how to build monuments in stone, hard stone. He was also said to be a great doctor and a great astronomer, and generally a very wise man. Anyway, he figured out how to do this kind of building. And part of what we learned from this pyramid is that on the north face of the pyramid, over here, there is a little, I'm going to show you another picture, there's a little sort of chamber with a statue of Djoser facing north. And that little chamber is called the Serdab. And the Ka statue, Ka refers to one of the terms the Egyptians used for the soul. The Egyptians had multiple souls, at least 5, probably more. But the two that I like to remember are the Ba and the Ka. The Ka is your breath of life. The Ka is what leaves you immediately when you die, when you stop breathing. It's sort of like the Qi in China. It's the breath of life, the animation. Okay? The Ba and the Ka doesn't have a personality. It's the Ba that carries your personality, your characteristics, your likes and dislikes, your appetites, everything that makes you an individual is in the Ba. And the point of all this is that when you die, the Ba gets separated from the Ka, and everything that you do in the religious rites surrounding death in Egypt is toward the objective of reuniting the Ba and the Ka and the other, how many ever kinds of souls you have. Here's the way the pyramid evolved. It was originally just a flat surface made of stone piled up to make a platform. That platform is called a mastaba, and it's an imitation of a building that people would live in, except that nobody ever buried anybody underneath a building that they lived in Egypt. It did happen in Mesopotamia, but not in Egypt. But for pharaohs, they wanted to be buried under the ground, under a building that reminded them of a building that people would live in, because the point of reuniting the Ba and the Ka was that once your soul got back together, you would live a life that greatly resembled the life you had before death. So, of course, you would want to be near something that reminded you of a house. Later, there was a series of steps added, and later still that was enlarged to make the step pyramid. Okay? So, who can tell me what is the symbolism behind the pyramid as a shape, as a structure? What does it refer to? I'll give you a hint. There's two kinds of pyramids. There's a step pyramid and a smooth pyramid. Yes? By means of climbing the steps to heaven, okay? This is a device that allows you to climb the steps to heaven. And in the smooth version? Yes?
We were told in Egypt that it represented their creation myth, that it was the birth of the land with the gold pyramid at the top.
That was certainly involved, yes. And the shape itself, it can refer to just making your thoughts go up. That's exactly what goes on in a cathedral, right? That's the reason the cathedral is so high. It takes your thoughts up, okay? Here's the point I want to emphasize. Almost every ancient people, when they thought of the spiritual, they thought of looking up, okay? So it's no accident that astronomy was extremely important to all the ancient peoples. It was not a science, although it was the first successful quantitative science in history. It was not just a science, it was an endeavor of the spirit. Okay? And there are also people who say that the smooth pyramid refers to the rays of the sun coming down. You can sometimes see that when there's a hole in the clouds, these bright rays coming down at a slant angle. But thoughts going up and climbing the ladder to heaven. North. Here's the little serdab, the little chamber on the north side with the statue of the Ka of Djoser facing north. And why was he facing north? He was facing north because the Egyptians thought that there was something special about the stars in the northern part of the sky, around the pole star. There's a certain number of stars, it varies depending on the latitude, but there's a certain number of stars close to the pole star that never rise or set. They just rotate around the pole star, but they're always above the horizon at all times. And the Egyptians referred to these as the indestructibles or the imperishables, and it was natural to them that a soul which was beginning its journey to be reunited and brought together again, especially a pharaoh's soul, would go up to the northern stars in the region of the pole, because that's where immortality would be found. This whole theory was elaborated tremendously in the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza. There's a whole system of internal chambers and passageways and shafts that refer to astronomy. We're going to go through these. We're going to come back to this picture, but first let's start with where the tomb was in the step pyramid at Saqqara, there is nothing. There's an empty room which isn't even finished. Okay? So Khufu took a very different approach to using this as a tomb, and it's in fact unique. There's no other pyramid with this kind of internal structure above ground within the bulk of the pyramid itself. And it's very possible that this was done deliberately to foil tomb robbers, because the tomb robbers had gotten used to the idea that the tomb was in the bedrock underneath the pyramid. So he put something there for them to find. It just wasn't the tomb. Okay? And you can see from the fact that Herodotus repeats this story, which he picked up from visiting Egypt many thousands of years later, that the tomb was down here, that if that's Khufu's intention, he was very successful. Everybody believed that the tomb was down there. Now, in the 9th century, the Caliph al-Mamun, who was the successor of Harun al-Rashid, decided to visit Egypt, which was under his control, and to try to enter the inside of the pyramid to find the riches that must be hidden there. And this, remember, the limestone casings had not yet been removed. Once they were removed, and indeed after people got inside and came back out, they found that there really was an entrance, but it was completely invisible to al-Mamun when he started his work. And so he picked a spot a little bit lower down and actually a little bit more toward the true center. Turns out they had picked something a little bit off center for the entrance. And so what did he do? Well, by that time they had steel, but still limestone is a pretty tough rock, and so basically what they would do to try to break in was they would set a fire right next to the rock until the rock got glowing hot, and then they would pour cold vinegar on it, which would kind of crack the surface of it. And then they'd break that away with their iron chisels and heat it up again, pour vinegar on it. Very slow and painful process, but they did manage to get inside and to... Because vinegar reacts with limestone. There's a chemical reaction going on there. So he managed to start his own passageway into the core of the pyramid and got pretty far in, and at a certain point, the story goes that they were ready to give up. They figured there was nothing in here, and somebody heard a large rock dropping someplace over there to that side. And so they turned their tunneling over to that side, and they finally reached the original descending passage, which started at this opening they hadn't found, but they came back up it later and found where it was. They went down this descending passage, and this right here was where that stone fell. There was a stone plugging this ascending passageway. It was the first, only the first of many plugs, but it was a stone covering this, which would have made it invisible if it had been in its original place. So they were down here somewhere. They broke into the original passageway. They went back up and saw this rock that had fallen, but there was a lot of other plugs behind it. So they went down to the lower chamber where everybody had been told to expect something great, precious, and it was an unfinished cave with absolutely nothing in it. So they were disappointed, but they had accidentally dislodged this rock from the ascending passageway, and so they tried to go back up here. And they so they had the one plug that had fallen down, they cleared that away, and behind that were more plugs. And these plugs were granite, hardness of 6. They'd been working with the limestone. There was nothing they can do even with their iron tools with this granite. And so they actually burrowed a passageway around the granite plug and came back in, and what did they find behind the first granite plug?
Another one.
A second granite plug. So they went back and burrowed around it and came back again, and what did they find behind the second granite plug? A third granite plug. They went around that, and they finally got back into where the plugs were only limestone, and they were able to break those down. There were many of the limestone plugs. They didn't even record how many they were, but they finally got up into the ascending passageway, found this level passageway into a nice, truly finished chamber with nothing in it, except a little recess. That recess wasn't that big originally. They tried to dig away thinking there must be something hidden in there, but never found anything. And they called this the Queen's Chamber because it looked consistent with what their current idea of a queen's tomb would look like. It turns out they were exactly right. But then they went back to the ascending passageway and started to go up instead of across, and they came to what? Well, it's a little bit hard to see, but it's absolutely one of the most stunning sights in any ancient monument. A huge gallery, it's called the Grand Gallery, where the rocks, the ceiling rises up, I forget the number, but 30 or 40 feet above your head, and this long passageway with this very high ceiling, not very wide at the base and narrowing so that the ceiling won't collapse. And well, why on earth would you put this grand gallery in here? Well, now you have to come back to remember that the pyramids were very carefully both located and aligned, okay? They were located at the 30-degree parallel of latitude, almost exactly. In fact, the error in placing it at the 30-degree parallel is about 1 minute of arc. That's 1/60th of a degree of latitude. And why did they make that small error of 1 minute of latitude? Because they didn't know about atmospheric refraction. They aligned and situated based on the stars in the northern part of the sky, basically the pole star, although it was a different pole star at that time. In fact, there really wasn't a pole star. I'll talk about that later. But they aligned it with a star, and as we now know, the atmosphere is a substance. It's not a vacuum. And when the light enters the top of the atmosphere, it gradually gets bent a little bit. And that bending for something at the altitude of the pole star would be just about 1 minute of arc. So any remaining error in that situation would have to do with the fact that they placed Khufu's pyramid as far north on the bedrock in that area as they could. If they had been any more accurate by their measurements, they wouldn't have had firm bedrock to build on. So they did a phenomenal job of locating it at 30 degrees latitude, and they also did a phenomenal job of aligning it north and south. So the two side walls, the side bases of the pyramid point within, again, a couple of minutes of arc to true north. Now, when you have something that's aligned to true north, what you can do with that is, if you have any kind of a wall that is aligned with the building true north, then if you watch this, if you have this wall, say, on your left, and you're looking south at night, and you see the stars as they one by one appear from behind this wall, if that wall is running north-south, when they first appear, they're at their highest point in their travels through the night sky. Okay? So you can determine the coordinates of a star to make a map by using your north-south wall, figuring out how high up that wall the angle is when that star appears, and then using some kind of a clock to determine the passage of time from one star appearing to the next star appearing, and that will give you the angle this way. And you can use that to build a very accurate map of the stars. So some people think, and I'm inclined to agree, that this grand gallery, at the time when the pyramids were built up to about this level, while the work was still going on, the astronomers were called out and said, okay, check the alignment of the building. We want to make sure absolutely sure we did this right. Okay? And furthermore, probably had a great opportunity to improve their knowledge of the positions of the stars. They'd never had such a great astronomical instrument before. So you go up this grand gallery, and at the top it levels off. There's a little anteroom, and you go in here to the king's chamber. And what did they find in the king's chamber? Well, pretty much what they found in the queen's chamber. Nothing. Except for this sarcophagus, which is made of granite, just like all the walls and the ceiling in this room. Again, polished to an incredible smoothness, incredibly accurate fits of the joint, with a material that's so hard that the only way we know of that you could have smoothed it in those days was to pound the darn thing with a dolerite ball until your arms fell off. Yes?
When people were going to the pyramids, was there like a lack of oxygen?
Ventilation is a problem, and in fact, there was some speculation that those shafts I showed you, I'm going to tell you more about, were actually for ventilation, but that's nonsense. It is hard to breathe, and they don't let too many people in at one time. One of the interesting things that was later found in conjunction with the king's chamber, here's a little diagram of what is right there. Here's the top of the grand gallery. Here's the little anteroom. And then you have to stoop down and come in here to the king's chamber with the empty sarcophagus. And Al-Mamun's crew got here. Later, much later, it was found that there was some superstructure above this. There were 5 what are called relieving chambers. You have to remember the incredible weight of stone that is on top of this chamber inside the building. If you don't do something to relieve the weight of that stone on the ceiling of the chamber, it's going to collapse. So they have relieving chambers above it. In fact, there are 5 of them. 5 was a very favored number by the Egyptians. By the way, I forgot to mention, the queen's chamber was at the 25th course of stones. The king's chamber is at the 50th course of stones. The whole thing is about 200 courses high. So 5 relieving chambers, and in the 19th century, somebody dug through the limestone here and got into these relieving chambers and found graffiti, which had been there apparently since the pyramids were built. Now, I'm surprised nobody talked to me about who these workers were. Who were these workers who did all this work to build the pyramids? Yeah. Sorry? Prisoners, slaves, that's a common opinion, yes. The evidence is accumulating, however, that that's absolutely not true. These were people who were very willing to do, and indeed enthusiastic about this work. This was a national project. Some of the evidence for that is what's being uncovered in the workers' compounds around the pyramids at Giza. They find, for example, that these workers were very well fed. There are pits filled with bones of meat-bearing cattle, and the bones indicate that these cattle were slaughtered when they were relatively young, and their meat was tender and delicious at the age of about 2 years. How would you figure that out if you were an anthropologist? Yeah?
Size of bones, maturity.
The maturity. This, first of all, you have to know how to recognize the cattle bones from wild animal bones. Something about the size, but probably also the maturity. There's something probably about the structure of the bones, how they grow, that's going to give you information like that they were 2 years old. So they were well fed, and they had these graffiti. Work team, the white crown of Kunum Khufu is powerful. That's one of these, I don't know which one it is. That was a work team. They were proud of their work. They were well compensated for their work, and they did their work during the season when the fields were flooded and they couldn't work their farms. They were happy to have a national project to work on where they would be fed well and taken care of. Now, you have to understand that there's two sides to every story. So it used to be thought that these were slaves or prisoners. Now it's thought that they were very enthusiastic participants. But you have to keep in mind that these are now the modern Egyptian archaeologists who are claiming this. So they have a vested interest in making it look like it was a national project and a point of pride. But there is pretty good evidence that at least some of these teams were very well treated. There was a time of the year, because the way agriculture was done in this riverine culture with the Nile flooding, there was a period of a couple of months when all their farmland was flooded. And remember, the reason they were such good geometers was when the flooding went away, they had to find their fields again. Okay? And all the markers were wiped away. So that's why they were so good at geometry. Every year they had to survey and find out where their farmland was. But it also, that flooding period presented an opportunity to employ these people on other things besides farming, which could very well have been a national project. Now I'm going to get back to the star alignments. So there are, in the king's chamber and in the queen's chamber, there are little openings in the wall about this big, square, and into those openings there's a little channel that goes in level for 5 or 6 feet, and then it starts sloping upward at a very constant and precise angle. Imagine the stonework that's involved in, you're laying blocks square on a grid this way, but you've got this slanting weird angled channel coming up through it. Tremendous amount of skill. Turnbull got together with an Egyptologist by the name of Alexander Badawi and determined accurately the angles that these two from the king's chamber sloped at, and figured out that they would have aligned perfectly with the belt stars of Orion at the transit, remember, directly south. When it passes that wall that's straight up and down and oriented north-south, that's the highest point in the sky, that's the transit, and that is the angle which matches perfectly with the angle of this air shaft, and the so-called air shaft. They called them air shafts at first because they thought they were for ventilation. The shaft on the north side from the king's chamber aligns pretty closely with where the pole would have been. Now, in this diagram, you're seeing the sky the way it used to be. I'm going to talk some more about that. And the North Pole Star was not here, but somewhere around here. And then in 1993, a German robotics engineer built this little contraption to travel up the shafts from the Queen's chamber, and together with Robert Bauval, another engineer who knew the astronomy involved, they were able to determine that this shaft aligned with Sirius and this shaft aligned with some other star. We'll see that in another picture better, okay? Now, we don't know by any means all the constellations that the Egyptians used, but there is one thing that is absolutely not in doubt, and that is that the constellation that we think of, Orion, they thought of as Osiris, one of their principal gods, the god who was most intimately involved in the passage through the underworld when the Pharaoh died and attempted to come back to an eternal life. And to the Egyptians, the star that we call Sirius was Isis, the companion, the wife of Osiris. Okay? So that is why we can say now that the Al-Mamun's original guess that this was the Queen's chamber and this was the King's chamber were absolutely right on. Now here's the way the pole star looked, the polar region looked in the time of the ancient Egyptians. And what is wrong with that picture? Where's the pole star? What do we call our pole star? Polaris, right? But Polaris is not anywhere near the center of the northern side. These are circles made by stars as the sky turns at night. Okay, and the center is right here somewhere. In the time of ancient Egypt, there was no star at that unmoving pivot point in the northern sky. But there were two stars, one below it and one above it, that you could draw a line between those two stars and it would go through the pivot point. And we now think that these two, drawing a line through those two stars was the basic means of orienting the pyramids. And another one of the constellations that we do know is that this was Wepwawet, if I'm saying it correctly, and this is a ceremonial instrument, a sort of axe that is used in the ceremonies for the dead king, the dead pharaoh, called the opening of the mouth. And this tool helps in opening the mouth, which is to make sure that the ba and the ka have actually left the body. Okay? The ka will go right away, but the ba, maybe you have to help it along a little bit. And so there was a ceremony called the opening of the mouth that would ensure that this happened. Now, what is wrong with this picture is that we don't always think about a change that happens very slowly in the night sky, which is precession. Okay? The Earth is a spinning top. It's spinning on an axis whose angle is about 23.5 degrees from the plane of the orbit of the Earth around the sun. The Egyptians, of course, didn't think the sun was the center of the solar system, but this tilt is clearly evident in how you perceive the seasons, and so the tilt itself was very well known, this number 23.5 degrees, except it's not always 23.5 degrees. Remember I said the Earth is a spinning top. What happens when you spin a top? It'll spin straight for a while, but as it slows down, it will start to wobble. And it will describe something like this. Okay, and as it slows down, the angle will get deeper and deeper until it falls over. But that precession is also experienced by the spinning top of the Earth. Except that the Earth is so big and so heavy that to do one of these cycles takes 23,000 years. Okay? So as this precession happens, it's all explained by Newton's physics, the pole star shifts. And the pivot in the sky, if you will, at any given time, there may not be a star there, but there is a pivot of the sky, and that pivot of the sky will precess around that part of the heavens and complete its circuit in 23,000 years. Now, I just have to throw in that this precession is almost certainly associated with the waxing and the waning of the ice ages. So here's a picture of that spinning top tilted, and there's the circle, and there are 4 different times when reasonably bright stars happen to be the pole stars. Most of the time, you're not so lucky. And so here's what happens. This wobble is caused by the sun, earth, and moon together. Okay? You need all 3 of those things, plus an earth that's a little bit flat at the poles and a little bit bulging at the equator. All those things together, throw in some Newtonian physics and mix, and you will find the precession of the Earth's axis. And there is a system on the Earth which involves the ice sheets, how much sunlight they reflect, and how much they weigh down the mantle of the Earth, and then the Earth rebounds. Did you know that we're still rebounding from the last ice age? The seafloor, for example, around Holland is actually rising about 2 millimeters a year, still recovering from the weight of the ice sheets that covered the northern part of the Earth. And this is an issue in global warming because it greatly complicates attempts to determine whether sea level has been rising in the last 100 years, because this recovery rebounding is a significant effect. So just one more word on the precession. Because of the shift in the pole star, the pyramids are still aligned, but you wouldn't use the same stars that they used then to align them, north-south. And one of the ways in which we now are able to date the pyramids, one of the best ways of dating the pyramids, is by figuring out which stars those shafts should have been aligned with at that time and seeing how much the sky has shifted by precession. Turns out that's the most accurate date for the pyramids. Archaeologists working on the ground can't do better than that. So although the Egyptians may or may not have known about the phenomenon of precession, because it happens, they coded the date of construction into their structures. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Osiris and Isis. Osiris was one of the most important gods in ancient Egypt. And there was a story which was that Osiris was probably the original pharaoh in some sense, who taught farming to the Egyptians. And because of this, he was, of course, extremely popular. But his brother Seth was jealous of Osiris and plotted to assassinate Osiris and cut his body up into pieces. Well, his wife Isis was a little bit psychic, and she foresaw that this was going to happen. And she wasn't able to prevent it, but as soon as it happened, she was able to find all the body parts that his body had been cut up into and put them back together, breathe life into him just long enough that they could conceive a son. And we have a little parenthetical here, which I suppose it's probably good that the 6th graders aren't here now. There was one part of the body that was missing, and Isis had to improvise somehow. And but they did conceive the son, and then Osiris went to the underworld to preside over it, while Horus, their son, grew up to avenge his father against Seth. Okay? Here's an example of a funerary object with a symbol of Horus, which is a falcon with outstretched wing. So, Osiris becomes the god of the underworld, and he is the one who will judge you. If you are a pharaoh, most certainly. He is the one who will judge you in the underworld after you have died to determine whether you will have an afterlife or not. Okay? There was no hell. If you didn't pass this test, there was a monster who ate you. End of story. Okay? But there was a heaven, there was an afterlife, and if you passed this test, you achieved it, you attained it. And what was the test? Yes? Weigh the heart against a feather. The Egyptians thought that the heart was not only the source of emotions, but thought and intentions. They didn't regard the brain as terribly important. They thought it all took place in the heart, which is pretty natural when you think about how you feel when something emotional happens. It certainly always intimately affects how your heart is responding. And their conception was that the heart would be weighed down with your sins. And if the weight of your sins was more than the weight of a feather, you flunked. Okay? But so here is Anubis, god of the dead, adjusting the scales. I suppose this is the heart and this is the feather. I'm not quite sure. But well, it's hard to say. I guess he's still adjusting the scales. It looks like we're in trouble here, but I'm sure this guy is going to pass because this is, after all, the Book of the Dead. And the Book of the Dead is a description of all these things that are going to happen to the Pharaoh in the underworld, how he's going to be judged. And there was always, or almost always, a copy of the Book of the Dead buried with the Pharaoh, sort of like a little crib sheet, okay? You're on the way. What do I do next? Oh, yeah, right. So the Book of the Dead tells all about what's going to happen, and this is the crucial moment, and we're ready to find out the result. And here's another illustration from another copy of the Book of the Dead much later. And here is the person who's involved, not a pharaoh in this one. All these funeral rites became very gradually democratized. So at first it was only for the pharaoh, then it was for the princes and the princesses, then it was for the master architect and the court hangers-on, and pretty soon everybody was worried about their afterlife. And here she is, raising her hands. So this copy of the Book of the Dead that was buried with this lady actually prejudged the issue. She was bound to succeed. And by the way, the upraised arms is one of the Egyptian symbols for the Ka. So this is an indication that the Ka and the Ba are going to be successfully reunited. Now I'd like to come back to the pentagram, and this is a real heartbreaker. That bowl, that's nice. That is harder than granite. Harder than granite. And they have worked it to a thinness that it's translucent and perfectly smooth. Absolutely no idea how they did that. Absolutely no idea. But it does have a five-pointed pattern. Here's a vase with a rope net around it that has 5 points around the circumference of it. And the significance of 5 in Egypt and in most ancient cultures was twofold. It's the human number, right? The number of fingers on your hands. 5 is the number of humans, okay? But it's also the number of Venus. The planet Venus completes 5 full cycles going through morning star and evening star, morning star and evening star. 5 of those cycles in 8 Earth years. And if you will plot the location of Venus against the background of the fixed stars at the point at the same point in its Venus cycle, over 5 cycles, you will get the pentagram. The pentagram, which was the symbol of the Pythagoreans and many other people as a symbol connecting the human with the heavens, giving them some feeling that there was some system to it all. Now, as I said, the point of the funeral rites was to ultimately provide that the Ba and the Ka and the other souls would be reunited so that the dead person could have an afterlife that greatly resembled the life he had in reality. And he was going to need some food, some entertainment. He was not going to need the physical part of the food, but the food will also have a Ka component of it, a breath of life component. And he would need that Ka component of the food to stay well during his afterlife. And so there were all kinds of objects placed in the tomb to symbolically provide him with the comforts and the needs that he would have during his normal life. Okay? And at first they probably actually put food in there, but then they realized that you couldn't count on your great-great-great-grandson to keep bringing oranges every day. And so they put in little sculptures that stood symbolically for the food and the things that the successfully reborn person, reborn after life, would need or want. Here is a mural, probably from Saqqara, in which there is a herd of cattle, and there is a herdsman, and the way he's getting his herd of cattle to cross the river is that he picks up the calf and carries the calf across, and then the mother and everyone else will follow. Some other prince came along and said, no, I need that tomb, and covered this up with a wall, which was just ever so slightly separated from the original stela, but it was completely covered up for thousands of years, and when they opened it up, they found it in wonderful condition, and this is a list of all the offerings that he would need: food, incense, medicines, eye paints, linen cloth, everything he would need or want. Yes? Unguents, creams, medical creams. Here's another one from Saqqara, duck catching. These guys are pulling very hard, as hard as they can, on a huge net, which is going to trap the ducks. And these guys are bringing the various fowl that they've captured back. Okay? So here's another one. Sister of Khufu, actually. Another stela from Giza, which is now in the Louvre. And again, food items. Apparently there are also some cosmetics in this area up here, but definitely food items. And these are counts of how many birds and so on this person is going to need. And here is the first indications that all this is going to gradually be democratized. Here are some statues which were obviously going to be used for funeral purposes, but they are statues of an artisan who made statues. So all this stuff became a great industry. You would want the symbols of what you would need in life with you. You would want a copy of the Book of the Dead with you to carry along as a crib sheet when you went to the underworld, to the judgment, and this became a great industry. And because the desert is so dry, a lot of this stuff is fortunately preserved for us. Now, I just want to say one more word about the art of this, and that is that sometimes these poses look rather formal. And for example, let's go back to this one. I don't know if you can see it, but the people in this are really totally incidental. They're very sketchy. They're not individuals at all. They're just basically one step beyond stick figures in terms of representation. All the care and loving artistry is put into what's really important here, which is the food that this guy is going to need. Okay? And so you have to keep in mind when you're looking at Egyptian art, particularly funerary objects, which is, I mean, almost everything we have is funerary objects because this was so important to the Egyptians. All these funerary objects, if you don't think they look naturalistic enough, just keep in mind that all these things were going to be placed in a tomb, and there was going to be a ceremony right before the door was closed that was going to bring these things to life for the pharaoh. Okay? So if the poses look artificial, they're on the verge of coming to life. Just on the threshold. Now I'm going to come back to Orion's belt, and I have one more delicate matter to deal with, which is that the constellation of Orion was to them Osiris, and the belt stars were not the belt. They were that piece of the pharaoh's anatomy that Isis had to improvise. And so the theory was proposed recently by Robert Bauval that the arrangement, I'm sorry, this is a little bit dark, but the arrangement of the three pyramids in the Giza plateau corresponds very nicely with the arrangement of the three stars in Orion's, well, middle part. And the third one is slightly offline from the first two and distinctly less bright. And so this is Robert Bauval's explanation of why was that third pyramid smaller. Well, Menare, the third pharaoh who had the third pyramid, had no objection at all to having a smaller pyramid because he was the last piece in the puzzle. He was going to finish it. And nobody else was ever going to have a chance to be a part of this again. Certainly not at 30 degrees latitude. That spot was taken. So he was quite happy to have a small pyramid just to be part of this symbolism. And you'll find some people who specialize in archeo-astronomy who object to the fact that you have to take a mirror image of the picture you take in the sky to superimpose it over the pyramids, but that's okay. That's natural, okay? Mirror image, that's the way it is when it's over you, okay? If you could imagine yourself going up above the celestial sphere and looking down, you wouldn't have to do any mirror image at all. It would be perfect. So that's not an objection to this theory. Getting toward the end, I'd just like to point out an interesting coincidence, which is if you look at the constellation Orion, you'll see the knees, the forearms, and the belt. And in the region below the belt, but above the knees, there's a triangular region there, and right in the middle of it is the Orion Nebula. You can actually see it with the naked eye. It's kind of a little glow in there. There's some couple of fainter stars hanging down from the belt that Greeks saw as the sword of Orion, and right below that sword is the Orion Nebula. And so this was part of Osiris, who was one of their most important gods, governing the underworld and the possibility of being reborn again. And it turns out that this Orion Nebula is a place that astronomers study today as being a very rich area of new star formation. And here you can see, just barely, this is a cloud of dust surrounding some kind of clump that's coming together as a planet. It's called a protoplanetary object. It's got enough stuff in it that gravity is going to keep pulling it together and make a solid planet out of it. As an aside, it happens that this same triangle with the Orion Nebula was regarded by the Maya as the hearth of creation. The Orion Nebula was the first fire that was struck when the universe was created. And finally, I'd like to say a couple words about Egypt versus the Mesopotamian cultures. If you read the historians of math and science, they will try to convince you that the Mesopotamians really had much more sophisticated mathematics than the Egyptians gave evidence of having. But there's two things that you have to keep in mind. Well, there's actually three things. There's three things that you always have to keep in mind in dealing with history. The more you go back, the more important these are. And they are ignorance, ignorance, and ignorance. And in all three cases, I'm not talking about their ignorance, I'm talking about our ignorance, okay? We just have no idea of what they knew, okay? We have no idea how they worked granite to such fine precision, okay? We have no idea what their real mathematics was. In the case of the Egyptians, we have papyri which were found in tombs which were undoubtedly like the Book of the Dead. They were cheat sheets, okay? This was not the real mathematical knowledge. This was a cheat sheet in case you went before Osiris and he happened to ask you a math question, okay? So we have mathematical papyri, but they're not the real mathematical content. What happened to the real mathematics that the ancient Egyptians knew? Where did it end up? Where would that knowledge, if it survived to the time of the Roman Empire, where would it have been kept? Yes. In Alexandria, in the museum, the library at Alexandria. And what happened to the library? It was burned in a war, okay? And at that point, what happened to those books that were burned? If they were written in living languages, there was a scholar someplace who had memorized the book and could just write it down again. But if it was in a dead language, like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, end of story. Can't be reconstructed. Okay? Furthermore, papyrus, it's a wonderful thing, keeps very well in dry desert air, but nothing like this. Clay tablets? Are you kidding me? This stuff is going to last forever. Okay? We even have clay tablets which were scratch pads kept in shops of short-term calculations that were being done during the day that were never meant to be kept, but the shop caught on fire and baked the clay tablet into eternity. So again, ignorance. We just don't know what the Egyptians knew for numerous reasons. And finally, I'm going to try to bring this story forward. If you read what the Greeks said, not what we think, but if you read what the Greeks said, they said they got everything from Egypt. They got all their knowledge from Egypt. Pythagoras spent 15 years in Egypt. And what did he have to do? He probably had to spend 5 years convincing them that he was worthy to get the knowledge that they had. Remember, knowledge was power. Knowledge was sacred. Knowledge was something you just didn't publish in the newspapers. Knowledge was guarded very closely because it was of tremendous value. You wouldn't give it to anybody. You would give it to somebody who was willing to shave his head and be a penitent for 5 years, and then you might start to tell him things. Okay? And the Greeks did this. Pythagoras did this. Other Greeks did this. And they said that they got all their knowledge from the Egyptians. Now, when did we come up with the idea that the Greeks created everything from scratch? Well, believe it or not, it happened in the 18th and 19th century. And it's an unfortunate fact of life that Romanticism, which has many great things about it, also has a dark side, which has to do with racism. And in the 18th and 19th century, it was decided that it was just not appropriate for all this knowledge to come from an African country. And there are whole books written about this, one called Black Athena, which gives you all, chapter and verse, all of what the Greeks said at the time. We got it from Egypt. Okay? So here's Herodotus. Who's Herodotus, by the way? I've been throwing up quotes by Herodotus. Who's Herodotus?
Historian. He was supposed to be at the Battle of Thermopylae, but he was also exaggerating a lot.
Excellent, excellent. Okay? He was the first person that we know who thought it was worth his trouble to go to various countries and ask them what they thought of their history, what they knew about their history, and wrote it down. And so he's called the father of history. He was also, as you indicated, sometimes very uncritical about what people told them. Okay, you say, all right, I'll write it down. 100,000 people work on the pyramids. That's probably a huge exaggeration. Modern day estimates say you could probably do it with about 20 or 30,000 people. Still a lot, but Herodotus later became known for being so uncritical that he's also, along with the father of history, sometimes called the father of lies. But he says there are some Greeks who have adopted this doctrine of reincarnation, some in former times, some in later times, as if it were their own invention. Their names I know, but refrain from writing down. And here's the guy he was thinking of, absolutely, Pythagoras, who had a theory of reincarnation, pretended it was his own, but probably got it from Egypt. Okay? That's it.